In the previous video, we have seen how to use throw keyword in Java. So this is completed. In this video, we will see some interview questions about exception handling in Java. Okay, the first question is, what is an exception in Java? We have seen in the previous videos that errors are mainly two types. So one is a compile time error and second one is a runtime error. And these runtime errors are called exceptions. So an exception is a runtime error. In Java, exception is an object. So normally exceptions are created when an abnormal situations are arised in our program. We have already seen some examples on this one where when we try to divide something by 0, then it will throw an arithmetic exception. Similarly, when we try to retrieve an element from an array, from an index that doesn't exist in the array, then we will get array index out of bounds exception. So these are abnormal situations. So when an abnormal situation is arised, then we get an exception. Exceptions can be created by JVM or by our own application code. All exception classes are defined in java.lang package. Second question is, state some situations where exceptions may arise in Java. So you can remember the two examples that I have mentioned in the previous question. One is when we try to divide something with 0, then we will get an arithmetic exception, and another one is when we try to retrieve an element from an array from an index that doesn't exist in the array, then we will get array index out of bounds exception. So accessing an element that doesn't exist in an array. So this will give array index out of bounds exception. Second one is dividing an integer by 0, arithmetic exception. And these are some more examples of exceptions. So you can remember these as well. One is invalid conversion of a number to string and string to number. This will give number format exception. And next one is invalid casting of a class. We will get class cast exception. Next one is trying to create object for interface or abstract class. That means we cannot create an object for an interface or abstract class, but if we try to create an object for an interface or abstract class, we will get instantiation exception. So these are some of the exceptions. Next question is, what is exception handling in Java? So exception handling is a mechanism of what to do whenever some abnormal situation arises in our program. For example, let's say I am dividing something with 0. So this is an abnormal situation. So exception handling is a mechanism of what to do when some abnormal situation arises in our program. If we don't have this exception handling mechanism, then Java will terminate the program whenever it sees this abnormal situation. So in order to not to terminate the program and to proceed further, we need to have exception handling in Java. So exception handling is a mechanism what to do when some abnormal situation arises in our program. When an exception is raised in program, it leads to termination of the program when it is not handled properly. The significance of exception handling comes here in order not to terminate a program abruptly and to continue with the rest of the program normally. This can be done with the help of exception handling. So next question is, in how many ways we can do exception handling in Java? There are mainly two ways. One is by specifying try catch block where we can catch the exception, and second one is using throws clause. So we have a throw clause also. Throw clause is used if we want to intentionally raise an exception. So that doesn't come under this. If we want to handle the exceptions that are raised by the program, then we can handle the exceptions by using a try catch block or a throws clause. Next one is list out the 5 keywords related to exception programming. So the 5 keywords are try, catch, finally, and then throw, throws. So these are the 5 keywords we use. We have seen examples for all of these in the previous videos. Explain try and catch keywords in Java. So we have already seen an example for this one as well. So what we normally do is, what are the exception causing code, we'll put it in a try block and then we catch the exception using the catch block. Again, we'll have to have this exception object here. So exception E, and then we'll catch the exception here. So in the try block, we'll have the code that will cause the exception, and in the catch block, we'll catch that exception. In try block, we'll define all the exception causing code. In Java, try catch forms a unit. A catch block catches the exception thrown by preceding try block. Catch block cannot catch an exception thrown by another try block. That means this catch block can only catch the exception thrown by this try block. If there is any other try block, then this catch block cannot catch the exception thrown by this try block. This has to be done by corresponding catch block only. If there is no exception causing code in our program, then exception is not raised in our code. JVM ignores the try catch block. Can we have try block without catch block? So this one, you have to remember this one. So each try block requires at least one catch block or finally block. Either you should have a catch block or you should have a finally block. Without having any of these, then the compiler will throw an error. A try block without catch or finally will result in compiler error. We can skip either of catch or finally block, but not both. That means at least one should be there, either catch block or finally block. And next one is, can we have multiple catch blocks for a try block? In some cases, our code may throw more than one exception. In such case, yes, we can specify two or more catch clauses. That means we can have one try block, but we can have this catch, I'll say arithmetic exception here, and then another catch block, let's say array index out of bounds exception, E1, and then this another catch block. So we can have multiple catch blocks as well. Each catch handling different type of exception. That means, let's say this catch one, it is handling arithmetic exception, and this catch block will handle the array index out of bounds exception. When an exception is thrown, JVM checks each catch statement in order, and the first one which matches the type of exception is executed and the remaining catch blocks are skipped. Can we have code between try and catch blocks? No, we cannot have code between try and catch blocks because they should come one after the other. That means once we have a try block, then we should have a catch block compulsorily. We cannot have a code between this try and catch. Explain the importance of finally block in Java. So finally block, we have already discussed this one. Let's say we have a try block here and we have a catch block here, and then we can have a finally block here. So this finally block will execute the statements whether an exception is raised and catched in these try blocks or not. That means whether an exception is raised or not, this finally block will be executed. It won't bother about this try and catch. So this finally block will be executed. So normally this finally block is used to close any socket connections or database connections, or to close any files, that means socket connections or database connections, or closing any files, etc. So for all these things, normally we use this finally block. So finally block is used for cleaning up of resources such as closing connections, sockets, etc. If try block executes with no exceptions, then finally is called after try block without executing the catch code. If there is exception thrown in try block, finally block will execute immediately after catch block because the exception has to be catched in the catch block. So once the code in the catch block is executed, then finally block will be executed. If an exception is thrown, finally block will be executed when, even if the no catch block handles the exception. That means the final block will be executed whether an exception is raised or not. Can we catch more than one exception in a single catch block? Yes, from Java 7 onwards, we can catch more than one exception in a single catch block. That means, let's say I have a try block here. If we want to write multiple catch blocks, then I will say catch arithmetic exception here. And I will write another catch block. It is array index out of bounds exception. But these two catch blocks can be combined like this: catch, array index out of bounds exception, or arithmetic exception. This way we can combine the two catch blocks. From Java 7 onwards, we can catch more than one exception with a single catch block. This type of handling reduces the code duplication. When we catch more than one exception in a single catch block, catch parameter is implicitly final. We cannot assign any value to the catch parameter. Next question is, what are checked exceptions? So we have seen in the earlier videos that there are two types of exceptions. One is unchecked exceptions and another one is checked exceptions. So these unchecked exceptions are checked at runtime. That means only at runtime we will know that there is an exception causing code. But checked exceptions are checked at compile time. That means the compiler already knows that some operations will cause an exception, may cause an exception. So the compiler itself, it complains that we have to catch those exceptions, and the compiler tells it at the compile time itself. So those are called checked exceptions. So checked exceptions are the exceptions that are checked at compile time. If some code within a method throws a checked exception, then the method must either handle the exception or it must specify the exception using throws keyword. That means we should handle the exception using try catch block, or we should handle that using throws keyword. So some of the examples are IO exception, SQL exception, file not found exception, invocation target exception, clone not supported exception, class not found exception, instantiation exception. So these are some of the examples of checked exceptions. So what are unchecked exceptions? So just now as we discussed, these unchecked exceptions are the exceptions that are checked at runtime. That means we cannot know that, the compiler won't know that the code, some particular piece of code may cause exceptions. So it will throw them generally during runtime. So some of the examples are arithmetic exception, array index out of bounds exception, class cast exception, index out of bound exception, null pointer exception, number format exception, string index out of bound exception, unsupported operation exception. So these are some of the unchecked exceptions. Explain the differences between checked and unchecked exceptions. So unchecked exceptions and checked exceptions. All the subclasses of runtime exception are called unchecked exception. Let's see this diagram. So in this one, throwable is the superclass and error and exception are the subclasses. And if you see within this error, there are two kinds of exceptions. One is checked exceptions, that means these are compile time, and unchecked exceptions, that means these are runtime. So all the subclasses of runtime exception are called unchecked exception. All the subclasses of throwable class except runtime exceptions are called checked exceptions. Unchecked exceptions need not be handled at compile time. That means they will be handled only at runtime. Checked exceptions need to be handled at the compile time. These exceptions arise mostly due to coding mistakes in our program. So some of the examples are array index out of bounds exception, class cast exception, arithmetic exception, index out of bound exception. So these are all unchecked exceptions. So some of the examples for checked exceptions are SQL exception, file not found exception, class not found exception. So these are some of the examples of checked exceptions. So what is default handling mechanism in Java? When JVM detects exception causing code, that means let's say I have an exception causing code. I'm dividing something with 0. Okay. So what JVM does in these cases? It constructs a new exception handling object by including the following. One is name of the exception, description about the exception, and location of the exception. So JVM by default, it constructs an exception handling object with name of the exception, description about the exception, and location of the exception. Once it creates the object, then it checks whether there is an exception handling code or not. That means it checks whether we are handling the code with a try catch block or not. If there is no exception handling code, that means if it doesn't find these try catch blocks, then what JVM does is it gives the responsibility of exception handling to the default handler. That means it has already created this default exception handling object. So what it will do is it will give the responsibility of that exception handling to this default object and terminates abruptly. That means the code will be terminated here. If it doesn't find a try catch block, then it gives the responsibility of the exception handling to the default exception object that it has created. So it will give the responsibility to this default exception object. So the default exception handler displays description of exception, prints the stack trace and location of the exception, and terminates the program. That's how so this default exception object, it prints the description of the exception and the stack trace and location of exception. It prints these three things and the program will be terminated here. So the main disadvantages of the default exception handling is program terminates abruptly. Can we have nested try statements in Java? So in Java, yes, it is possible. We can have nested try statements like try and then another try within this try. So these are nested try statements. So we can have nested try statements in Java. Explain the importance of throwable class and its methods. So if you remember this diagram, throwable class is the super class for error and exception. So the question is about the importance of throwable class and what are its methods. So throwable class is the root class for all the exceptions. All exceptions are derived from this throwable class. The two main subclasses of throwable class are exception and error. There are three main methods under this throwable class. They are print stack trace. So this prints the exception information in the following format, like name of the exception, description, followed by stack trace. And then get message. This method prints only the description of the exception, toString. It prints the name and description of the exception. So that is about throwable class. In this video, we have seen some interview questions about exception handling in Java. If you want to download the document for this one, you can go to my repository at github.com/supposetech and then go to Selenium-Java-tutorials. This particular tutorial starts with numbering 24D. This is the document Selenium-Exceptions-interview questions. In the next video, we will see about file operations in Java, Java input and output, and file path operations.